The very first Olympic Games in all of history had exactly one event. It wasn't 100 events, or even 10, it was just a single short foot race, and then everybody went home. The man who won that one race became the first Olympic champion ever recorded, and he was not a king, a warrior, or the son of a god. He was simply an ordinary cook. His name was Coroebus, and he was a baker from a small Greek town called Elis. In the year 776 BC, he ran faster than everybody else, and that one sprint wrote his name into history forever. So if you have always assumed the first sport in history was the ancient Olympics, I have some bad news. That famous foot race was not the beginning of sport, because sport was already thousands of years old. So if the Olympics arrived that late, then what on earth actually was the first sport? This is a real argument among historians, and it comes down to two main contenders: running and wrestling. Running has a genuinely lovely case because it is the simplest and purest sport imaginable. It needs no ball, no field, and no equipment. And humans have been running since long before we were even fully human. But that simplicity is also running's biggest weakness, because you can never actually prove that running was ever a sport. Sprinting away from a hungry lion is not a sport. It is just a very bad afternoon. Wrestling is the complete opposite, because wrestling is something we can actually prove. Almost everywhere that humans appeared on Earth, they drew the very same picture of two people grappling while a crowd looks on. So here is the real answer, and it comes with solid evidence. The first sport in history was almost certainly wrestling, and we know that because ancient humans simply would not stop drawing it. Our first piece of proof sits in a cave in Mongolia, in a region called Bayangkongor. Two figures were painted onto the rock around 9,000 years ago, locked in a wrestling match, with a crowd gathered around them. That little crowd is the detail that changes everything, because a fight all by itself is simply a fight. But the moment a fight has an audience watching it, that fight has quietly become a sport. So 9,000 years ago, long before any Greek was born, people were already gathering in a cave to watch two wrestlers go at it. When it comes to the first real sport, wrestling got there first. The wrestlers do not stop there. About 4,000 years ago in Egypt, there is a row of tombs at a place called Beni Hassan, and the walls are completely covered in wrestlers, roughly 400 pairs of them. One single tomb holds 122 pairs, all by itself, and no two of them are in the same position. It is basically a step-by-step wrestling manual, painted carefully onto a wall 4,000 years ago. The artists even colored the two wrestlers differently, one light and one dark, so you could follow whose arm was whose in the tangle. That is not decoration at all. That is a genuine instructional diagram. And these were not the tombs of ordinary people. They belonged to powerful governors who wanted to be remembered forever, surrounded by wrestling. In ancient Egypt, the sport was not lowbrow, it was completely elite. Wrestling was not the only sport on those walls either. The same Egyptians also painted swimming, archery, javelin, weightlifting, gymnastics, and even a game of tug-of-war. 4,000 years ago, they were basically running their own Olympic. Out in the Sahara Desert, there is even a cave that people nicknamed the Cave of Swimmers. It is filled with tiny figures that look like they are doing the breaststroke, in a place that is now nothing but bone-dry sand. Over in ancient Iraq, the land of Mesopotamia, the sports keep on coming. There was wrestling and boxing too, and one carving from over 4,000 years ago shows two boxers with their fists raised, ready to swing. Wrestling even appears in the oldest story that humanity ever wrote down, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is around 4,000 years old. Remarkably, that ancient tale has a full action scene right near its beginning. The mighty king Gilgamesh meets a wild man named Enkidu, and the way these two legends become friends for life is that they wrestle. They grapple so hard in a doorway that the doorposts shake and the whole wall trembles. There is even a little bronze statue from Iraq, made about 4,500 years ago, of two wrestlers gripping each other by the belt. That is belt wrestling, an actual rule of the sport, cast forever into solid metal. But here is where the story takes a twist, because on the opposite side of the planet, people were inventing a completely different kind of sport. They were building a team ball game, and to play it, they invented something incredible. In ancient Mexico, more than 3,000 years ago, people wanted a ball that could actually bounce, so they figured out how to make rubber. The oldest rubber anywhere on Earth was created simply because people wanted something to play with. The oldest rubber balls ever discovered are about 3,600 years old, which makes them older than the first Olympics by more than 800 years. They were not made for war or for work, they were made purely for sport. The game itself was genuinely brutal. The ball was solid rubber and as heavy as a bowling ball, and players could not use their hands or their feet, so they struck it with their hips, on stone courts, centuries before the first Greek ever sprinted. So while the Egyptians were painting wrestling, and the Mesopotamians were boxing, people in the Americas were bouncing rubber balls off their hips. Absolutely everybody, right across the ancient world, was busy playing some kind of sport. Which brings us all the way back to those Greeks in 776 BC, with their single little foot race and their cook in a crown of leaves. By the time the Olympics finally began, sport was already ancient history, and that cook, Coroebus, is a far bigger deal than he first appears. The Greeks became so obsessed with the Olympics that they started counting the years by them, so their whole recorded timeline effectively begins with a running baker. That original sprint even had its own name because it was called the stadion, one length of the track, roughly 200 meters. And that single word, stadion, is exactly where we get our modern word stadium. So every stadium on Earth today, every enormous bowl packed with screaming fans, is quietly named after one short Greek sprint that was won by a baker. The games faded away, but the word has survived for over 2,000 years. The Greeks were also intensely serious about their sport, and champions won statues, free meals for life, and poems in their honor. They also competed completely naked, and their word for the training ground, the gymnasium, comes straight from their word for naked. That means your local gym is, quite literally, the naked place. You could also argue that the oldest game of all is really a board game, because the Egyptians were playing one called Senet around 5,000 years ago. But quietly sitting at a table is not really a sport, because a proper sport is supposed to make you sweat, and wrestling absolutely makes you sweat. So let us finally answer the big question directly. If the first sport means the oldest one that we can actually prove with a picture, then the answer is wrestling, painted in a Mongolian cave 9,000 years ago, complete with its own little cheering crowd. But if you want the very deepest answer, you first have to ask a stranger question, which is this. What actually is a sport in the first place? Wonderfully, the answer is hiding right inside the word sport itself. The word sport is simply a shortened form of a much older word, which was disport. And back then, disport did not mean competition, or winning, or fitness. It meant something far simpler and far more lovely than any of that. To disport yourself meant to carry your own mind away from serious things, because it comes from the Latin words for to carry and for away. It really meant escaping real life for a while, to play and to mess around purely for joy. So the true definition of a sport is not about a ball, or a rule, or a shiny trophy at all. A sport is simply fun that you decided to have on purpose, and that idea is older than any cave, any city, and any word. That means the first sport was never invented by a Greek, an Egyptian, or a cook named Coroebus. It is older than farming, older than writing, and it might genuinely be older than our entire species. It was the first moment that two human beings looked at one another, with no lion chasing them and no dinner on the line, and simply decided to compete anyway, purely to see which one of them would win. We can never put a date on that moment, because it is older than any painting and older than any bone. But the oldest sport we can actually hold in our hands, the first one we ever chose to draw, was wrestling. It was two people grappling in front of a tiny painted crowd, 9,000 years ago. So the next time somebody tells you that sports are pointless, remind them that playing is one of the oldest human things there is, because we were athletes long before we were farmers. This has been Truth Explorer, and if you love true things that quietly demolish a history textbook, then you already know exactly where that subscribe button is. I will see you in the very next one.